War of the Worlds. The War of the Worlds.
Now then, we're on to book 2 now, aren't we, on War at Worlds? So this is book 2, chapter 1, The Earth Under Martians. And what this is really about is, structurally, you've got halfway through a book, and, you know, this is a whole new, not just chapter, but a whole new section, really. And what it means is you've got the first section, the coming of the Martians. It could go either way. Now, this is a sort of acceptance, really, because you've got the Earth under Martians, and people having to cope with that, you know. So this is a very different section book, and it's marked as 2 separate books for that reason. So again, you'd want to write this down as a structural point, I would say, and the fact that the Earth under Martians marks a whole new section. The Martians are here, the Martians have taken control, and this is about living under the Martians, literally, well, not literally under the Martians, good grief, but under the control of the Martians. That's what it's about. So structurally, you'd want to make a point about that, being the book being separated into 2 clear, distinct sections, partly because of the way in which it was serialized in a magazine when it was first published, but also to mark a sense of inevitability, the fact that the people now have to cope with being living under Martian control. And so this is a new section. There's not so much optimism now because, of course, the Martians have gained control, and this sets the mood for this section of the book. So we're going to get into this first chapter of the second book, and this chapter is called Underfoot. And I'm going to chip in with my comments, and we'll take it from there, really, and hopefully it'll be useful to you, you know. So with no further ado, let's stop jibber jabbering and crack on with chapter 1.
Book 2. The Earth Under the Martians. 1. Underfoot. In the first book, I have wandered so much from my own adventures to tell the experiences of my brother that all through the last 2 chapters, I and the curate have been lurking in the empty house at Underfoot, whither we fled to escape the black smoke. There, I will resume.
Right, so what do you make of that then? He's talking to us as the reader directly, isn't he? And he says, in the first book, I've wandered so much from my own adventures. So he's talking in the first person, and he's explaining the way in which he gave his narrative. So he's directly addressing the reader. Now, it's a very interesting technique, because what that does, and you'll know this yourselves, is it makes it far more realistic, far more credible, far more authentic. And you can use any of those words to describe it, because it feels like he's explaining to us and justifying the way in which he's telling his narrative. So it must be true, mustn't it? Must be true. So what you've got there then, you've got this very, what's called, it's metafiction, because it's meta, M-E-T-A, fiction, metafiction. And it's a structural technique, I suppose, really, because it's using that direct address about the writing itself. It's very much aware of its own process. It's aware of itself. It's meta, which means about. So meta means about. So metafiction is fiction about fiction, and this is fiction, but it's made to feel like it's fact. And that's the whole point of the book, is to make it feel real and frightening. So he's using that technique there, almost pulling down the fourth wall. If you do drama or theatre studies, you'll know that pulling down the fourth wall or breaking fourth wall is about being self-aware of the production and actually addressing the audience. That's what he's doing here. Don't say breaking the fourth wall, because that's not relevant, but it is metafiction and it is direct address, but the effect is exactly the same.
We stopped there all Sunday night and all the next day, the day of the panic, in a little island of daylight, cut off by the black smoke from the rest of the world. We could do nothing but wait in an aching inactivity during those 2 weary days.
So, I mean, main thing to take away from this is the fact that we're back in the narrative of the narrator now, because the brother, of course, has gone off with Miss Elphinstone and Mrs. Elphinstone. They've gone off to Ostend. They've gone on the boat, the steamer, and off they go across water. But we're back now with the narrator. Now, funny enough, they've done nothing for 2 days. Well, that's a practical thing, isn't it? Because, of course, they couldn't do anything really, because it was almost like we pressed pause on their narrative, because all we were hearing was from brother, weren't we? So we've now got we're now sort of almost resuming we are resuming the narrative. So there's a narrative shift here, which is a structural technique, back with the narrator, and of course their story couldn't really continue until we'd finished with the brother and the two ladies trying to get to the East Coast, which of course they did very, very successfully.
My mind was occupied by anxiety for my wife. I figured her at Leatherhead, terrified, in danger, mourning me already as a dead man. I paced the rooms and cried aloud when I thought of how I was cut off from her, of all that might happen to her in my absence. My cousin, I knew, was brave enough for any emergency, but he was not the sort of man to realize danger quickly, to rise promptly.
One of the things you'll have noticed in this book is the characterisation and the different types of people you meet. And some of them are very practical people, and others are not so practical. And you can put the narrator and his brother in the very practical camp, because they're survivors, aren't they? Whereas some of these other characters are a bit foolish. The curate, for example, is a fool, and he gets the sense that his cousin in Leatherhead he might be okay, but he's a bit of a numpty where being proactive is concerned. He's not the sort of person that would realise danger very quickly, so he worries for his wife's safety, and of course he's right to do so, because who of us wouldn't worry about our loved ones in wherever they might be? And of course there's no communication, no way of staying in touch, so it's a continuing thread of concern. And we know that the wife in Leatherhead is someone that he wants to return to, and of course at the end of the book we come back to her and they're reunited. So it's also another narrative hook technique in the book that H.G. Wells uses to keep the reader engaged. There's a love interest there, and it's propelling the story forward and reminding us, of course, that he wants to get back to his wife.
What was needed now was not bravery, but circumspection. My only consolation was to believe that the Martians were moving Londonward and away from her. Such vague anxieties keep the mind sensitive and painful. I grew very weary and irritable at the curate's perpetual ejaculations. I tired of the sight of his selfish despair.
Just to remind you again there about that old-fashioned Victorian term there, ejaculation. It just refers to sort of outbursts and things that the curate must be saying and repeating himself mindlessly. So he's getting sick and tired, as of course you would do, wouldn't you? You'd be stuck up in a shack with the curate for 2 days. It'd do anybody's head in, I would imagine. And the narrator's no different. He's absolutely sick to the back teeth of it.
After some ineffectual remonstrance, I kept away from him, staying in a room, evidently a children's schoolroom, containing globes, forms, and copybooks. When he followed me thither, I went to a box room at the top of the house and, in order to be alone with my aching miseries, locked myself in. We were hopelessly hemmed in by the black smoke all that day and the morning of the next. There were signs of people in the next house on Sunday evening, a face at a window and moving lights, and later the slamming of a door.
So, I mean, here the details have been stuck in the house for 2 days on end. I mean, blimey, we know how it feels, don't we? We've had 4 weeks of it now, 5 weeks of it, I don't know, I've lost count, don't even know what day it is really. And yet there they are, 2 days in lockdown because of black smoke, they can't get out, and so they're just looking out at window and seeing if they can see any signs of life, and they see a little bit here, a little bit there, nothing really to say about it. Just, I suppose you could list the asyndetic list of a face at the window, moving lights, and the slamming of a door. But there's a sense of not knowing who the people are or any sort of connection with people, And the curate, he's even locked the curate out, only to get some peace and quiet away from the curate and his random ejaculations. And there he is, locked away, just for some peace and quiet. But they're very isolated, and that's not good for anyone's mental health. And blimey, don't we know it? They're not even out clapping for carers, are they, on a Thursday night? I mean, that's the least they could do, really. But I suppose no NHS in those days, no carers to be supporting them or for them to support. Anyway, back to the story.
But I do not know who these people were, nor what became of them. We saw nothing of them next day. The black smoke drifted slowly riverward all through Monday morning, creeping nearer and nearer to us, driving at last along the road outside the house that hid us.
Couple of things to say about that, really. I mean, what you've got is you've got that repetition at word nearer and nearer. So I suppose, well, I'd just call it repetition, really. Oh, excuse me, I'm a little bit weary. Bit sleepy, bit sleepy. Repetition of the word nearer, just to show how incrementally closer the Martians are getting, the black smoke's getting to them. And, that's very dangerous and it increases the dramatic tension. But also, have you noticed, I'm sure you have noticed, that the black smoke is capitalised? H.G. Wells has turned it into a proper noun, the black smoke. And what that does is it sort of personifies it, doesn't it? It sort of makes it seem like a real living thing, like a real enemy, a real character in book. So I'd certainly be prepared to write down, if you can fit it on page, I'd write down personification if you can, if you're able to. Would you like me to spell it for you? I-T. Do you get that? Do you want me to spell it for you? I-T. Anyway, I'll spell personification for you just to give you a little helping hand. Personification. What about that? What a coincidence! It splits off into groups of three. I would have thought it. Lots of words do that, don't they? Have you ever noticed? That? I have. Let's get back to the book before we lose plot, eh?
A Martian came across the fields about midday, laying the stuff with a jet of superheated steam that hissed against the walls, smashed all the windows it touched, and scalded the curate's hand as he fled out of the front room. When at last we crept across the sodden rooms and looked out again, the country northward was as though a black snowstorm had passed over it. Looking towards the river, we were astonished to see an unaccountable redness mingling with the black of the scorched meadows. For a time, we did not see how this change affected our position, save that we were relieved of our fear of the black smoke.
Something I'd just like to draw your attention to, and I'm sure you found it yourselves and noticed it yourselves, is the narrator's use of time and tense we've got here. So for a time, we did not see how this change affected our position. Well, what that does is it suggests that with hindsight, he's looking back as he writes this narrative and he can see now that things did change, but at the time they couldn't see it. So what you've got there is you've got that past tense perspective, and it reminds us that this has been written at a later date with the benefit of hindsight. So it's always reminding us, always just chipping away, reminding the reader that this is a real account, a real narrative of what happened. And so it just adds that sense of authenticity, and it's hard to know which letters to drop and which ones to keep in when you're doing this voice. Anyway, so it has that authenticity, and it just adds a bit more fear, really, a bit more, but not fear, but so much more realism, I suppose. And I guess that does get to tension and fear if you follow it through. Anyway, let's get back to it.
But later I perceived that we were no longer hemmed in, and now we might get away. So soon as I realized that the way of escape was open, my dream of action returned. But the curate was lethargic, unreasonable.
And here we have it, don't we? Look at this character foil. Characterization here. Look, you've got the narrator, he's got dream of action. He even mentions that word action. He wants to get stuck into it, he wants to get out at place, he wants to move on, he wants to get back to his wife in Leatherhead. But the curate, Well, how was he described it? Lethargic. Lethargic. Oh dear. Lethargic. Tired, sleepy, useless, lethargic, and unreasonable as well. Unreasonable. 2 adjectives there to describe Curate. He's not been presented as a very good character at all, is he, Curate? He's a bit of an umpty. So he's a very good character foil to compare with the narrator, I would say. And I think that's exactly why H.G. Wells has put them together, for that exact reason. And that's a structural point because they've been held up for comparison. You could even say, if you want to get a bit technical and you're looking to get a very high grade, as I know you all are in this exam, you might say they're juxtaposed against each other. So they're character foils that are juxtaposed against each other. So let me spell that for you. Juxtapoe. Oh no, not OE. OSED. No, that one doesn't split into 3s, does it? Never mind. Juxtaposed. Just suppose they're juxtaposed. Well, they are in this case.
We're safe here, he repeated. We're safe here.
Sorry to stop it again so soon, but we've got some direct speech, and direct speech is always worth stopping for and taking notice of what it's doing. And in this case, the direct speech gives us a real flavour of what this character's like, not just through description from the narrator, but actually from the words from his own mouth. You've got that sense of his character. And what he says, whenever he does anything, is he repeats himself. And we know that he repeats himself. We are safe here, he repeated, safe here. Now, there's something very ineffective about repeating and repeating and repeating over and over again. It's sort of ineffective and useless. It's not action, it's not moving forward, it's looking back. And that's the point here. So even the direct speech adds that sense of characterisation of him being useless, numpty, an absolute, well, I can't say the word really, can I? What can I say? Ineffective character, that's what I'll call him.
I resolved to leave him. Would that I had. Wiser now for the artilleryman's teaching, I sought out food and drink. I had found oil and rags for my burns, and I also took a hat and a flannel shirt that I found in one of the bedrooms.
You've got to stop it again, I'm afraid. Well, we've got that reference to tense and perspective again, just at top of paragraph. I resolved to leave him, would that I had. Now that reminds us that he's writing it from a future date, reflecting back on what happened, and he wishes, with hindsight, that he had left him. He wishes dearly that he'd left him, but he didn't. So it reminds us this has been reflected upon from a future point. It reminds us this has already happened and it's been recounted by the narrator, which therefore makes it seem much more realistic, and therefore it feels like non-fiction. It doesn't feel like fiction, it feels like a real event, which is exactly what H.G. Wells was going for, to create that sense of fear and to undermine the arrogance and the naivety of the British public at the time.
When it was clear to him that I meant to go alone, had reconciled myself to going alone, he suddenly roused himself to come. And, all being quiet throughout the afternoon, we started about 5 o'clock, as I should judge, along the blackened road to Sunbury. In Sunbury, and at intervals along the road, were dead bodies, lying in contorted attitudes, horses as well as men, overturned carts and luggage, all covered thickly with black dust. That pall of cindery powder made me think of what I had read of the destruction of Pompeii.
So, speaking of blending fact with fiction and making the fiction seem like fact, you've got here that reference to Pompeii and the Vesuvian eruption back in Roman times. And you'll know this, of course you will, but this is what it feels like, Tim. It feels like a real disaster, and it's something that really happened that everybody would know about, and is blending fact with fiction to add that real sense of authenticity and realism to his narrative.
We got to Hampton Court without misadventure, our minds full of strange and unfamiliar appearances. And at Hampton Court, our eyes were relieved to find a patch of green that had escaped the suffocating drift.
You'll have been to Hampton Court, haven't you? I'm sure you have at some point. It's in the district of Surrey, and just southwest of London, and it's well, you know who lived there, don't you? It was a very famous king lived there, King Henry VIII. He lived there, so it's a very important what we call a seat of power in Britain, and is mentioned that as a proper noun. It's a real place. Of course, you can still go there today. Well, not today because of course it's locked down, but figuratively speaking, you can still go there today. In these days anyway, and if you've been, you'll know it's got a very big maze, very famous maze made out of edges, and well, I got lost there when I went a few years back. It took me about 3 days to get out, but anyway, so the fact that this is mentioned is a very important seat of British history, and yet here it is in the I'm going to call it the kill zone, if I may, the danger zone, and so that adds that sense of drama, and I suppose there's a bit of a sense actually of what's called jingoism, and it means that sort of patriotic zeal and energy. You know, when people wave bunting and get all excited and wave their flags and feel very patriotic for the country, it's jingoism, and that's what we've got here. It's a sense of, hang on, no, they can't take Hampton Court. Hampton Court is where Henry VIII was. Can't be taking that, can you? Got to leave something. That's our history you're sort of destroying there. So you can see there what H.G. Wells is doing. He's mentioned that because it's such a famous historic landmark that is under threat by the Martians. So it's appealing to the British sense of identity and the British sense of themselves, of what's right and what is British. And Henry VIII is one of those things that is used then as now to represent Britishness.
We went through Bushy Park, with its deer going to and fro under the chestnuts, and some men and women hurrying in the distance towards Hampton, and so we came to Twickenham. These were the first people we saw.
Now, if, as I like to do, you're reading this book with a map open beside you, and I've actually bought the Ordnance Survey maps for this area, so I can read it with the map open beside me, and that's the sort of sad individual that I am, you know. I like to have a map open and chart with my finger on the map, and I can see where they're going. But I've bought them because I'm going to use them as a display up in the classroom. So if you're listening to this and that display at the back of the room, that's what it is. And but I like to see, and you can see what's happening here is it's getting closer and closer to capital. It's getting closer and closer to London. So you can see Twickenham, you can talk about Hampton, and you can follow this, and it's going in a line towards London, and that's incrementum, structural technique, because it's getting closer and closer to the capital city, which of course adds that tension and dramatic tension, yeah. So getting closer, incrementum, that's a structural point, and you can see it on the map. And if you've not got a paper map in front of you, well, shame on you for a start, but hopefully you can open up Google Maps or Apple Maps or Maps, whatever maps you want to use, and you can just have a little look, if you would, at where they are and where they're heading.
Away across the road, the woods beyond Ham and Petersham were still afire. Twickenham was uninjured by either heat ray or black smoke, and there were more people about here, though none could give us news. For the most part, they were like ourselves, taking advantage of a lull to shift their quarters. I have an impression that many of the houses were still occupied by scared inhabitants, too frightened even for flight. Here, too, the evidence of a hasty rout was abundant along the road. I remember most vividly 3 smashed bicycles in a heap, pounded into the road by the wheels of subsequent carts. We crossed Richmond Bridge about 8:30. We hurried across the exposed bridge, of course, but I noticed floating down the stream a number of red masses, some many feet across. I did not know what these were. There was no time for scrutiny, and I put a more horrible interpretation on them than they deserved.
Now, we know, of course, that this is actually the red weed, don't we, that grows in the next few chapters. But, of course, he's looking back with hindsight, and he puts a more horrible interpretation on them than they deserved. So, we learn, don't we, that that he thinks that they're body parts floating down river, but actually they're not that. And from the point of hindsight, looking back, he knows that they're not that, but at the time he didn't know that. So what do you make of that? I suppose it's a structural technique. It's a cataleptic reference, actually, if you will. Cataleptic is looking forward. Anaphoric looks back. Cataleptic looks forward. Looking forward to the red weed. Not looking forward to the red weed. It's awful, but looking ahead, I suppose you could say, to the red weed chapter. So it's cataleptic. So shall I spell that for you? Of course I will. CATALEPTIC. Cataleptic, and that just means looking forward, like a flash forward, really, to something that happens later on. It just keeps the reader engaged, it keeps them hooked, and when we do get to that chapter about the red weed, we know that idea has already been seeded in our minds from earlier on, if you'll forgive the pun there, seeded and weeded. Anyway, let's push on.
Here again on the Surrey side were black dust that had once been smoke, and dead bodies. A heap near the approach to the station, but we had no glimpse of the Martians until we were some way towards Barnes. We saw, in the blackened distance, a group of 3 people running down a side street towards the river, but otherwise it seemed deserted. Up the hill, Richmond town was burning briskly. Outside the town of Richmond, there was no trace of the black smoke. Then, suddenly, as we approached Kew, came a number of people running, and the upper works of a Martian fighting machine loomed in sight over the housetops, not 100 yards away from us. We stood, aghast at our danger, and had the Martian looked down, we must immediately have perished. We were so terrified that we dared not go on, but turned aside and hid in a shed in a garden. There the curate crouched, weeping silently, and refusing to stir again.
More dramatic tension there, of course, as they almost get killed by a Martian machine. But luckily they don't. Well, of course they don't, because he's the narrator, so he has to survive, otherwise the story wouldn't get told, you see. So they have to survive, don't they? But look at curate. He's ineffective, isn't he? He's an ineffective individual, I would say. The curate crouched, weeping silently, and refusing to stir again. So weeping silently, there he is. He's very ineffective. He's very unhelpful. He's not coping well with the stressful situation. And, who can blame him in a way? Who can blame him? Who knows how we'd respond, if we were in that situation? But certainly when compared and juxtaposed against the narrator, we can see just how ineffective the curate is.
But my fixed idea of reaching Leatherhead would not let me rest, and in the twilight I ventured out again. I went through a shrubbery, and along a passage beside a big house standing in its own grounds, and so emerged upon the road towards Kew. The curate I left in the shed, but he came hurrying after me.
We've seen this before, the curate running after the narrator, even when the narrator wants to leave him behind, the curate comes following after him. So what you've got here is a commentary really on the social dynamic of there are leaders and there are followers, and the narrator is something of a leader and the curate is something of a follower, definitely. And you can tell that just from his job title. I mean, the curate is, he's not a leader. He follows and administrates church services in very local parish churches, parochial churches. So not someone who wants to lead, but someone who wants to follow. And so I suppose in a way it's H.G. Wells's representation of all kinds of people in society, therefore making it more realistic. He's trying to give us a real slice of life, warts and all, and that's what we get here. We get all slices of life in this book.
That second start was the most foolhardy thing I ever did. For it was manifest the Martians were about us. No sooner had the curate overtaken me than we saw either the fighting machine we had seen before or another, far away across the meadows, in the direction of Kew Lodge. 4 or 5 little black figures hurried before it across the green-grey of the field, and in a moment it was evident this Martian pursued them. In 3 strides he was among them, and they ran radiating from his feet in all directions. He used no heat ray to destroy them, but picked them up, one by one. Apparently, he tossed them into the great metallic carrier which projected behind him, as much as a workman's basket hangs over his shoulder.
So that's a turn-up-foot box, isn't it? That's a different kettle of fish. You've got now the Martian in this separate section of the book, the second back half of the book, Life Under the Martians, not destroying people, but collecting them one by one and putting them into a big basket over his shoulder, a big carrier, much like a workman's basket hangs over his shoulder. So now we know they're collecting humans, and that changes everything. That we can see now how things are very different. They want to collect humans, and the more astute reader might be imagining that is to feed on and to act as fuel for the Martians, which of course is exactly right. That's even more sinister, isn't it, really, than just destroying them with a heat ray. I don't know what you think about that. I think it's more sinister and therefore ramps up the dramatic tension.
It was the first time I realized that the Martians might have any other purpose than destruction with defeated humanity. We stood for a moment, petrified, then turned and fled through a gate behind us into a walled garden, fell into, rather than found, a fortunate ditch, and lay there, scarce daring to whisper to each other until the stars were out. I suppose it was nearly 11 o'clock before we gathered courage to start again, no longer venturing into the road, but sneaking along hedgerows and through plantations, and watching keenly through the darkness. He on the right, and I on the left, for the Martians, who seemed to be all about us. In one place we blundered upon a scorched and blackened area, now cooling and ashen, and a number of scattered dead bodies of men, burnt horribly about the head and trunks, but with their legs and boots mostly intact, and of dead horses, 50 feet perhaps, behind a line of 4 ripped guns and smashed gun carriages.
Well, crikey, I mean, you've got here a semantic field of destruction, haven't you? You've got, blundered, scorched, blackened, ashen, scattered, dead, burnt horribly, dead horses, ripped guns, smashed gun carriages, and that's all just in that paragraph there. So just take your time to go back through and find those words that are in semantic field of destruction, just to re-emphasise how horrible the situation is around the narrator and the curate. And a little bit in the middle there of hendiadys as well, if you want to spot that. And it's that scorched and blackened area. Scorched means blackened, and blackened means scorched. It's the same effect, really. It's been burned by the heat ray, we presume. So hendiadys there, just to add emphasis to that sense of how much a destruction has taken place.
Sheen, it seemed, had escaped destruction, but the place was silent and deserted. Here we happened on no dead, though the night was too dark for us to see into the side roads of the place. In Sheen, my companion suddenly complained of faintness and thirst, and we decided to try one of the houses. The first house we entered, after a little difficulty with the window, was a small semi-detached villa, and I found nothing eatable left in the place but some mouldy cheese. There was, however, water to drink, and I took a hatchet, which promised to be useful in our next housebreaking.
Again, that reminder of hindsight there, that this hatchet is a little axe, which promised to be useful in our next housebreaking. Well, he didn't know that at the time, did he? But looking back with hindsight, he knows that it did come in handy. It came in useful for the next housebreaking that they did, and that's the very significant house that they broke into and stayed for a time there, and that's what was the curate's end. So it's just reminding us that this is that perspective, reminding us that this has been told in hindsight, and so that adds to that sense of authenticity and realism. I know I've said that a lot of times, but that's really what H.G. Wells is going for at this, I think, and just trying to make us feel very, very frightened that this is a real event. It's presenting fiction as fact.
We then crossed a place where the road turns towards Mortlake. Here there stood a white house within a walled garden, and in the pantry of this domicile we found a store of food: 2 loaves of bread in a pan, an uncooked steak, and half of a ham. I give this catalogue so precisely because, as it happened, we were destined to subsist upon this store for the next fortnight.
More reference there to hindsight. Obviously, at the time, he didn't know how long he was going to have to last on this food, but with hindsight, he realises now that they had to stay there for a fortnight, for 2 weeks, on 2 loaves of bread, an uncooked steak, and half a ham, and bottled beer, and haricot beans, and some limp lettuces. So that's nice. And some wine, some burgundy wine, some tinned soups and salmon, and 2 tins of biscuits. Oh, they'd be first thing to go, wouldn't they, biscuits? Especially them chocolate hobnobs. Oh, they're nice, aren't they? They're all right. Anyway, so this is reminding us that it's written from future, with looking back with hindsight, and he realises now how important it was that they found some way of food, and that's that already. So that's a structural point about perspective.
Bottled beer stood under a shelf, and there were 2 bags of haricot beans and some limp lettuces. This pantry opened into a kind of wash-up kitchen, and in this was firewood. There was also a cupboard in which we found nearly a dozen of burgundy, tin soups and salmon, and 2 tins of biscuits. We sat in the adjacent kitchen in the dark, for we dared not strike a light, and ate bread and ham, and drank beer out of the same bottle. The curate, who was still timorous and restless, was now, oddly enough, for pushing on, and I was urging him to keep up his strength by eating, when the thing happened that was to imprison us.
So what you've got here is a narrative technique as old as time itself, and it's called withholding information. Withholding information. And that's a structural technique, and what it does is it leaves gaps in the detail, and by referring to it as the thing happened that was to imprison us, is leaving out information, and that makes the reader, well, it engages the reader certainly to want to read the next section of the book to find out what the thing is. So by being purposefully vague and withholding information, that's a structural technique to engage the reader. Please don't write in the exam, it makes the reader want to read on, because that's what readers do, they read on because they're readers, aren't they? So, that's a silly point to make, but I know what you mean, and if you do write that, I know what you mean, but try not to try to write, it engages the reader, because it means the same thing, but it's just a bit more sophisticated in an academic style. So there you go, a bit of structure for you there.
It can't be midnight yet, I said. And then came a blinding glare of vivid green light.
Well, we know what that means, don't we, ladies and gents, or ladies in this case. A green light, that symbolises the Martians, doesn't it? So you could say, there's a couple of things you could say. It's a language technique, either way you look at it, really, but it could symbolise the Martians, and that's an important point. Or you could say that the green light itself is a synecdoche, because it symbolises something bigger than just a green light. It symbolises the Martians and the Martian invasion generally. So you could say synecdoche, 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 and that's a language point.
Everything in the kitchen leapt out, clearly visible in green and black, and vanished again. And then followed such a concussion as I have never heard before or since. So close on the heels of this as to seem instantaneous came a thud behind me. A clash of glass, a crash, and a rattle of falling masonry all about us, and the plaster of the ceiling came down upon us, smashing into a multitude of fragments upon our heads. I was knocked headlong across the floor against the oven handle, stunned. I was insensible for a long time, the curate told me, and when I came to, we were in darkness again, and he, with a face wet, as I found afterwards, with blood from a cut forehead, was dabbing water over me. For some time, I could not recollect what had happened. Then things came to me, slowly. A bruise on my temple asserted itself. "Are you better?" asked the curate in a whisper. At last I answered him. I sat up. "Don't move," he said. "The floor is covered with smashed crockery from the dresser. You can't possibly move without making a noise. I fancy they are outside."
Well, what about that for dramatic tension? Don't get much more tense than that, does it? They're both whispering, so you've got direct speech and whispering, and that makes it sound even more tense if they're whispering like this. And he's whispering there to say don't move because they're right outside. So this is very, very critical. It's very tense at this point, and we're worried, aren't we, for curate and for the narrator at this point, because they've done so well so far. Be a shame now if something were to happen to them.
We both sat quite silent, so that we could scarcely hear each other breathing. Everything seemed deadly still. But once something near us, some plaster or broken brickwork, slid down with a rumbling sound. Outside, and very near, was an intermittent, metallic rattle. "That," said the curate, and presently it happened again. "Yes," I said. "But what is it?" "A Martian," said the curate. I listened again. It was not like the heat ray, I said, and for a time I was inclined to think one of the great fighting machines had stumbled against the house, as I had seen one stumble against the tower of Shepperton Church. Our situation was so strange and incomprehensible that for 3 or 4 hours, until the dawn came, we scarcely moved. And then the light filtered in, not through the window, which remained black, but through a triangular aperture between a beam and a heap of broken bricks in the wall behind us.
Just a very quick point here, but just language-wise, he's referring to these things around in a very technical detail. He's got, these... I've lost it now. Where is it? A triangular aperture between a beam and a heap of broken bricks. So he's using that scientific lexis again, or at least architectural lexis, if you wanted to call it that. But it's technical lexis at any rate, and what that does is it just gives us faith and confidence in the narrator that he knows his onions, he knows what he's talking about, and therefore we can trust him, and therefore it's more realistic, which is the effect that H.G. Wells, I imagine, was going for.
The interior of the kitchen we now saw greyly for the first time. The window had been burst in by a mass of garden mould, which flowed over the table upon which we had been sitting, and lay about our feet. Outside, the soil was banked high against the house. At the top of the window frame, we could see an uprooted drain pipe. The floor was littered with smashed hardware. The end of the kitchen towards the house was broken into, and since the daylight shone in there, it was evident the greater part of the house had collapsed. Contrasting vividly with this ruin was the neat dresser, stained in the fashion pale green with a number of copper and tin vessels below it. The wallpaper imitating blue and white tiles, and a couple of coloured supplements fluttering from the walls above the kitchen range. As the dawn grew clearer, we saw through the gap in the wall the body of a Martian, standing sentinel, I suppose, over the still glowing cylinder. At the sight of that, we crawled as circumspectly as possible out of the twilight of the kitchen into the darkness of the scullery. Abruptly, the right interpretation dawned upon my mind. "The 5th cylinder," I whispered. "The 5th, shot from Mars, has struck this house and buried us under the ruins."
So structurally, you'll remember that towards end of first book, he mentioned that he'd tell us about 5th cylinder all in good time, but he mentioned the sixth cylinder falling down in that chapter, The Thunder Child. Well, here he's come back to tell us about the fifth cylinder that come down. So he was right, and it's what's called an anaphoric reference, because it's something that we've already heard was coming, and now we've got it. So it's that fifth cylinder. It told us back at last chapter that he would tell us all about it, and now he is doing so. He's reminding us that this is, again, it's that narrative that's been controlled. It's been written from a future perspective with hindsight, and laid down for us in the order in which he thinks it's most sensible to do so. So it's a very authentic, feels like a factual retelling of events.
For a time, the curate was silent, and then he whispered, "God have mercy on us."
Now, I'll just chip in here with a very brief thought. There's not much to say about it. I mean, of course, the curate would say that he's a religious man. He's appealing to God. He's praying to God to have mercy on them. And who wouldn't at that point? It seems pretty dire for them. But as a quotation to have in your quotation banks ready for the exam next year, or this year if you listen to it now, of course listen to it now, there's no other time to listen to it, is there? But if you listen to it in preparation for your exam, and in many ways, aren't we all preparing for an exam of some kind, then you could say that this epitomises his character, because he looks to God for answers when he can't find them himself. So this quotation here, "God have mercy upon us," is a very good one to represent the curate, and the fact that he looks to God for reassurance when he can't find any elsewhere.
I heard him presently whimpering to himself. Save for that sound, we lay quite still in the scullery. I, for my part, scarce dared breathe, and sat with my eyes fixed on the faint light of the kitchen door. I could just see the curate's face, a dim, oval shape, and his collar and cuffs. Outside there began a metallic hammering, then a violent hooting, and then again, after a quiet interval, a hissing like the hissing of an engine. These noises, for the most part problematical, continued intermittently, and seemed, if anything, to increase in number as time wore on. Presently a measured thudding and a vibration that made everything about us quiver and the vessels in the pantry ring and shift began and continued. Once the light was eclipsed, and the ghostly kitchen doorway became absolutely dark. For many hours we must have crouched there, silent and shivering, until our tired attention failed. At last I found myself awake, and very hungry. I am inclined to believe we must have spent the greater portion of a day before that awakening. My hunger was at a stride so insistent that it moved me into action. I told the curate I was going to seek food, and felt my way towards the pantry. He made me no answer, but so soon as I began eating, the faint noise I made stirred him up, and I heard him crawling after me.
So there's not too much to say really about this last section, but just generally speaking, you've got some asymptotic lists of all the activity outside the house, and you've got the fact that the curate again follows the narrator at the end when he hears the sound of food, so again following the leader. And that's it for this chapter, and I've been Ari from Muddersfield, and maybe I'll see you again next time. Cheery bye.